Vanessa Varco Fontana, and I'm a member of at the Center of Transformative Action. And I'm also a Master of Management student at Mills College. And I'm really excited to welcome the closing conversation we have with Erica, Smiley, and Sarita Gupta. Let me share a little bit about their stories. Smiley is the executive director of Jobs with Justice, a longtime organizer and movement leader. She has been spearheading strategic organizing and policy interventions for Jobs with Justice for nearly 15 years. Prior to taking up her current position with the organization, Smiley served as an organizing director for Jobs with Justice, developing campaigns that resulted in transformative changes to how working people organize and are civically engaged at their workplaces and in their communities. During her tenure at Jobs with Justice, Smiley has served in numerous leadership capacities, including as campaigns directors and as senior field organizer for the Southern region. Smiley is originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. She is a proud product of public schools. Hey, and she currently resides in New Jersey alongside her partner and daughter. So thank you so much for being here with us. And let me share a little bit about Sarita. Sarita is the Vice President of U.S. Programs at the Ford Foundation, overseeing the foundation's domestic work, including civic engagement and government, creativity and free expression, future of workers, technology and society, disability rights, and gender, racial, and ethnic justice. Thank you so much for all this amazing work. She previously served as an executive director of Jobs with Justice, a leader in the fight for workers' rights that shapes public discourse on every front to build power for working people and create an economy that benefits everyone. She has been on the front lines of organizing and policy campaigns to boost wages, worker voice, and working conditions for all working people, and improve labor and civil rights protections for immigrant men and women. She also co-founded and led Caring Across Generations, which is a campaign effort calling for a much-needed care infrastructure to provide high-quality, affordable options for individuals and families, support for family caregivers, and the care workforce. Born in the United Kingdom and raised in Rochester, New York, Sarita currently lives in Maryland with her husband and daughter. And thank you so much and welcome, Smiley and Sarita.
So good to be here, Vanessa. Thank you.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Should we just dive in then?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start with Smiley.
Yeah, great. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. It's so interesting. Sarita and I, when we were thinking about putting this book together, we were trying to navigate, I was thinking about, even in preparation for this conversation, trying to navigate where to begin and what kind of caused us to do this. And I remember that it was shortly after the teachers' action in West Virginia when people began to step out and take courageous action. It was really interesting. One of the things we realized was that the first counties in that state to step out were in the southern part of the state. And I'm going to pull up a map here. The first counties to step out were in the southern part of the state, and they were not necessarily from what you would consider like the bastion of the left. They were in fact some of the more conservative counties in the area, if you could really think about it. And so, it was really important to pay attention to this, because I think we began looking at the country differently and trying to think through a different framework that would allow us to reach workers everywhere and not just focus in certain areas. And so, we started to think about the map, and we call this like our path to power. That's what's on the screen now. And instead of looking at the country through the lens of just the political framework of, who voted for who in the last presidential election, we felt like we needed to really look at the country and look at working people's belief in it through the lens of like whether or not people had access to 20th century forms of democracy, both political and economic. Our book on the future we need is actually about how we build the economic piece of democracy, that when we talk about organizing collective bargaining, that we aren't just talking about a worker's right, but actually how to get to democratic practice, how to actualize the vision of a multiracial democracy in the country. And so for me, being from a place that I think is often competing for the lowest union density in the country, North Carolina. I felt like, we couldn't just try to win this for people who already had access to it. And what you see on the map here is the blue states who could still elect people based on their values, who could still form a union using the 20th century framework, the National Labor Relations Act, and the like, that they could still consistently access those. We needed to mobilize in order to increase our ability to make decisions over economic lives. We needed to really focus on workers outside of those areas as well. And in fact, what we learned and what we were kind of agitated by when we were trying to understand what happened in West Virginia is that we learned that the people in a lot of these states, particularly in what you see in yellow states here, where people have long lost, if they ever had access to 20th century forms of democracy, had an appetite for something new, for something different, for something that wasn't just inclusion in the current frameworks, but was trying to imagine anew what it would look like, what types of systems and platforms we would need to exercise democracy. And so I feel like it's important for us to start here because oftentimes these discussions are very much centered in areas where unions are robust, where there's like progressive leadership and movement, or at the very least in what you see here is the gray states, in places where, perhaps it's a recent memory, the loss of some of the protections that they exercised before. But that the purpose of us trying to work on this book wasn't just to talk about workers' rights, but was to build a powerful, robust, multiracial democracy. And in this moment when so many people agree, or at least are noticing the crisis and some of the cracks in what we thought perhaps was a better structure, it's really important for us to take that into consideration, to try to think through what it would take. And within that context, to center race and gender, not just as a solidarity issue, but actually as a key to winning. And so again, coming from the southern region myself, really wanting to think about what it means that many of the states that I come from and that my family comes from didn't have access to some of these 20th century protections, and how the rest of the country will continue to go in that direction until we right this wrong. So I feel like we wanted to start there to kind of set the tone of discussion, because what we're going to be talking about today is collective bargaining, and not just in the sense of what people know unions do with, say, a traditional employer, but in the sense of what it would take for the majority of working people to negotiate their conditions, both with their employers, both how they look directly, as well as, like, say, the 21st century version of that, which can be more fissured, as well as applying it to other economic relationships. And so we took it on ourselves to write this book down and to engage particularly women, and many of the women in the book are workers and leaders who we have been in the struggle with, in the trenches with, in different moments, in different campaigns, and to center them not simply as people who had stories to tell about themselves, but people who actually were brainstorming the strategies that we talk about in the book that are behind it, and that it's in large part a book of women and women of color, not telling our struggles, but actually trying to argue what is to be done for our movement. And so maybe with that, I'll Sarita, it'd be great to kind of maybe jump into some of these case studies given our limited time, and then we can kind of begin to hash it out. And I can operate some of the slides for you if you want.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Smiley. And I just want to say it's so great to be here and be in discussion with you about the book overall. For people I feel like we should tell the title of the book, The Future We Need.
Right.
We really felt it was important to write this book, The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And because we wanted to be clear that we have an opportunity right now to shape the future we need, one in which workers can live and work with dignity, with agency, and with joy. And that given that there's many examples that we lay out in the book, as Smiley said, and given the context of this map. And so I want to talk a little bit about the domestic worker movement as a case study that we weave through the book, but is a fantastic example of exactly what we're talking about. So, as Smiley said, one of the major themes in our book is about the central role of struggles against white supremacy and gender discrimination. And we should be clear that there is entrenched white supremacy and patriarchy that has shaped labor laws in this country. And examples of that are domestic workers. These are nannies, care providers, child care providers, house cleaners, elder care providers who are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act and the Fair Labor Standard Act. And not only were domestic workers excluded, but so were agricultural workers. And this was a legacy of slavery and compromises of Southern politicians representing the interests of Southern plantation owners with Northern politicians when these pieces of legislation were developed during the New Deal. And these are legacies that continue to stay with us today. Well, in the last 10 years, we have seen the rise and the building of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, who have advocated and won basic protections and benefits for house cleaners and care providers all over the country. They've been doing this by creating domestic workers' Bill of Rights around the country, establishing some of these standards, and winning standards boards around the country where domestic workers are coming together with industry and with the state or the county or the city, depending on the jurisdiction, to develop, new standards around wages, around training opportunities, around time off, and much more. But what's been really interesting and exciting to Smiley is not only have we seen them do this great work through the policy arena, but then this case study I want to share is about how they worked with their newly launched partner organization, the National Domestic Workers Alliance Gig Worker Advocates, to launch a first of its kind pilot program to advance workers' interests on the platform. So the NDWA, Gig Workers Advocate, is an organization that was launched by domestic worker movement to improve the quality of jobs for gig economy workers. Handy is an online marketplace for home cleaning, installation, and other home services, and the biggest online cleaning dispatcher. So the agreement is the first of its kind between an advocacy organization for gig workers and a gig economy company. The pilot program extends to Handy Pros, which are the workforce on the Handy platform, in the states of Florida, Kentucky, and Indiana, who book cleaning jobs on this platform. And what they were able to win through this agreement was $15 minimum base pay, substantive part-time off benefits, really anything more than what the minimum law has required in those states, and a contractual monthly process for Handy Pros, like the workers and company leaders, to raise, discuss, and address problems workers are experiencing on the platform itself. And this is a huge deal in the state. And of course, occupational accident like support in case they experience problems on the job. And so this is huge because these are big wins considering the really difficult legislative terrain in Florida, Indiana, and Kentucky, where much of the labor movement may have less political power. But the other thing to lift up is that Domestic Workers Alliance really carefully designed this pilot so as not to disrupt or contradict other moving strategies in the labor ecosystem while breaking open new ground for workers whose industries are really being transformed by the internet. So they were able to be completely bold and innovative while being really conscientious and in solidarity with the rest of the labor movement. This is a victory for thousands of workers, nearly all women of color who are denied even the minimal protections of traditional labor and employment law. So I just wanted to kick this off to say, This is a really big deal because I think we talk about platform workers and gig economy workers, but we should really like just to take a moment to talk about the challenges that workers face when they're working on a platform.
That's right.
One, they're managed by an algorithm and rarely able to talk to a live person. Two, their customer ratings determine their pay. They're penalized for canceling a job, even if they feel unsafe. There's little transparency regarding policies, protocols, data collection, and surveillance, and they have no access to their own data, which means they cannot take their experience or reviews from one gig economy platform elsewhere. So to me, this is such a great example of the kinds of innovations that we see happening. These are workers who weren't waiting for the laws to change. They went ahead and came together. They joined together collectively. They've negotiated for what they needed from Handy as the platform, and they've really helped open up a whole new terrain of protections that I hope can shape and make strides and open doors for other gig economy workers.
I love this example too, Sarita, because it's not like people think of domestic workers as platform workers, right? I mean, people think about Uber drivers and all these folks, and yet in some ways, domestic workers were the original gig workers. And can you just I know we have another example to share, but remind us what states they're in. I'm just going to go back to the map while you say it, because I think it's really
Sure, absolutely. So again, it's in Florida, Kentucky, and Indiana.
Right. And these are not like the states that are considered the hotbeds of progressive activism necessarily.
That's
I
right.
mean, it's a critical thing. And I love starting off with this case study because I think it's such a powerful example. I mean, you've got a sector of workers who have been excluded from the National Labor Relations Act explicitly. They're one of the few sectors that's been explicitly excluded. And because of that, they took that weakness and turned it into a strength and said, okay, well, if we're not under the jurisdiction of the NLRB, we'll just sign a regular private agreement and incorporate some of the same things. And it's amazing because it reminds us that, companies sign contracts with each other every day with they have lots of different channels to negotiate conditions and standards and costs. Why do workers only have one channel? That's actually not democracy at all. We actually need the ability to negotiate all of our economic relationships. And so, this next example is in another state, Texas, that's also not considered, a hotbed for progressive organizing. And I'm excited about this example in large part because this is a place where, let me just dive in. And I'm sorry, every time I switch slides, you get to see a picture of my cat Rizzo, her glamour shot. So whatever, we'll just lean into that and enjoy it. But this is Texas, right? It's some people say, oh, it's a purple state, maybe we can do stuff there, but it's hard. The news coming out of Texas is often not great. But one of the things that was really exciting is that during the pandemic, not exciting, workers began to be defined as essential. And this was a big shift, right? This wasn't that they were newly essential to the economy. They had always been essential to the economy. The pandemic simply exposed it for what it was. And what happened was that people who had perhaps historically just been considered low wage or parts of the invisible workforce gained visibility, and they did it in a sense that was based on their role in the economy. So they went from a position of perhaps exclusion to a position of power. And so workers in Texas, including some domestic workers, but also construction workers, airport workers, retail workers, came together in a coalition and said, we need decision making. And not all of us have access to a traditional union. There were some union folks there, but not everyone was. But we still need to be in negotiations with the industry and with the government on what are the protocols for workers who are essential, who have to work in any given crisis, and particularly in a public health crisis like a global pandemic. And here's a really funny story about this, right? So they were in this campaign trying to win a health and safety board for essential workers. And that was going to have decision-making power, not just advisory power, but decision-making power to set standards. And then, I don't know, many of you will remember that ice storm that hit Texas in November, I think it was 2020, right? And it was kind of a hot mess, shut down all their infrastructure. It was a hot mess. And we were like, oh God, like the campaign, what do we do? Like, this is going to set us back. And this was the fantastic thing. And also just was like a model of the resilience of workers, right? They were like, actually, we're considered essential too. Like, many of us had to keep working. And even though, we didn't have power and our families didn't have clean water, we still had to be out there. And it actually broadened the scope of their efforts to turn the Essential Worker Board, not simply something that was responding to a public health crisis, but something that could address workers deemed essential in any crisis, including the types of equipment and safety equipment they would need, including compensation, like hazard pay, and other issues that workers wanted to negotiate. And, it's so interesting because in the pandemic, we have learned, I don't want to say like it's in the past tense, unfortunately, but we've learned so much. We learned a great study from Andy Dean at George Washington that, they found that there were 30% less deaths in assisted living facilities where there was a union, some form of labor management committee, than there were in facilities that didn't have a union. And that's now been expanded around the country and through other sectors, finding similar rates of protection. So what we found, finally, perhaps scientifically, the thing that we knew anecdotally was that we're all better when working people are in decision-making ability. And it's not actually, it's so funny, Sarita, when I say it and I talk about it, like it seems so simple. It's like not like we're saying something super radical. I mean, we're just talking about everyday folks, and sure, mostly women, the women who often don't get the credit that they deserve, actually leading and setting strategy for that will ultimately benefit all of us, to benefit the rest of us. And I so love, we don't really talk about this as much as some of the talks we give, but it's actually really important. The fact that we have art in the book, right? We're going to see a picture of Rizzy one more time, and then we'll go into this. Whoops, I forgot I had a video there. But like this, the pictures of the workers. I was talking to someone about this recently. They're like, why did you do that? And I was like, like oftentimes the people who get to sit for portraits are like these very wealthy, I don't know, I have a picture of like the royals with like the big orb and scepter or whatever. And oftentimes the people who get credit for movements are like, the big charismatic, men or pastors or whatever in the front. And like, meanwhile, we know it's like the regular everyday, oftentimes women like in the basement printing the flyers and like pulling everyone together and keeping everyone together when they would otherwise falter. And so one of my favorite features of our book is that, we have these paintings of the workers we were talking with and basically the worker strategists who came up with so many of these approaches.
That's exactly right, Smiley. I agree with you. I think it's a huge contribution not only to lift up and profile worker strategists. I'm so glad you used that language, because I think often in books about labor or struggle, the way that people are talked about is this is like the problem I'm facing, and it begins and ends there, versus here's really the challenge that I face, and here's what I did about it. Like, I actually joined together with others and I made change in this way. This is what I learned from that, and this is how our strategy developed. And so I love that we were able to do that through the book. But the other really important element of doing this, I think, for us was to also culturally shift people's mindsets of who is a worker, who are leaders. There's this way that even today, when people think of a worker, they think of like a big burly guy in a factory.
That's right, with a hammer.
They don't think about the childcare provider taking care of their kid or their grandkid, or they don't think about the grocery clerk, or they don't think about the agricultural worker, and so like our ability to sort of really expand, like broaden the aperture, if you will, of who we mean is one thing. And then two, how we really contend with power, how we build power, because fundamentally this book is about power. And these stories are about not only the power that was wielded to make change, and the different levers of power that we need to pull to make change given the many changes in our economy today. But it's also the way that they were also transformed as leaders and found power in their voice and their actions, that we think is such a critical component of how we build a healthy democracy.
It's so true. And there's this question, just speaking of the question of power that you raised, right? Like, we talk about we can't do this without centering the fight against white supremacy and gender discrimination. And I feel like, after the book was officially published or all the manuscript and stuff was turned in, we have these two powerful cases that show that to be true. The first one was very recent. Actually, they happened around the same time, maybe on the same day. I think it was April 1st, right? So one was overseas in India, where garment workers throughout Southeast Asia and South Asia were able to negotiate a global bargaining agreement with H&M and then later with the Gap, basically on issues. They basically got them to the table through a campaign on gender-based violence. And in the context of that campaign, they then, after they got them to the table, they were able to talk through other issues, wages. They have something that's called preemptive retaliation, assuming that any steward that experiences retaliation, it's on the burden is on the company to prove that they didn't do it. That's pretty profound. And it's interesting because a lot of the leadership of those unions had been men, even though the workforce were women, and they had to form a separate committee to focus on gender-based violence and not just say some of the top line traditional, work site issues. And through doing that, it wasn't just something that was morally right. It was the thing that led them to victory. And then, you look here in the States on the same day, we have this completely unexpected victory, at least most of us didn't expect it, where Amazon workers, both in Staten Island and in Bessemer, Alabama, the leadership of whom were Black and were radicalized by the movement for Black Lives and said, you know what, this is our movement for Black Lives right here on the shop floor. They won. They won because
on Staten Island. Yep.
So many people on the floor were so aggravated that the company was so publicly for Black Lives, but inside the plant wasn't providing Black workers PPE, wasn't social distancing, wasn't telling them when people were sick, even arresting them when they asked. And so this question of power is really profound. And we talk, in the book, we talk both scientifically about it in the context of, where people have the power to stop production, where people can control, the skill set of a particular market or sector, where we have associational power. But there's also, I feel like what we hopefully get at is that there's power in centering the issues that our opposition often uses to divide us. And I found there's just Sanchioni, who's in the top center, who was, she's retired now, but started out as an auto worker in Dallas, Texas at Ford. My favorite quote from her was when she said that, she joined with other women in the plant to win a bathroom. That was the fight in the 70s, to win a women's bathroom on the shop floor. And she just kind of nonchalantly said, yeah, that was our women's liberation movement. And so I think it's, it's really profound to really think about, like you said, not only reframing who workers are, but also trying to keep ourselves from siloing these movements as if they aren't experienced all at once by some of the same people.
Yeah, it's a whole person approach, right?
That's right.
Whole person approach to organizing. And all of this, I think, leads us to the broader premise of the book, which is we can and should be building the democracy our ancestors imagined, right? One that really prioritizes majority participation, not only in our political, practice, but also in our economic lives and in every aspect of our economic lives, not just in the workplace, but the way that every single one of us interacts with the economy as a whole. And I think that idea of building that practice of democracy is really what we learned through these stories of all of these amazing worker strategists and leaders. And I think through the research you and I did for this book, and just based on our years of experience of organizing, we have been fortunate enough to work right in at the intersections of so many movements, but really with the labor movement and the worker center movement and the immigrant rights and women's movement and civil rights, racial justice movements and more, that we've really learned through all of this that now is the time for us to fight for a better democracy, given all the changes and attacks that are underway, the power of people learning that there's so much that can be done when we join together collectively and really negotiate with whoever, whatever entity is really making decisions in our lives, I think is a really important message of our book that I hope people will carry forward.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. And it's kind of like we couldn't have predicted how perfect the timing would be on the release. I mean, it's ironic because, you know, we really have been working on this for a long time. And I think originally thought it would come out much sooner, but it's amazing to see some of the campaigns we discussed come to fruition, and some of the experiments that were, you know, only theorized about in the book actually being practiced today. And, you know, I have to I guess close my points with this, and then, you know, maybe Sarita, I'll give you the last thought. But there's something so on purpose about this book and this moment. You know, a lot of people talk about the Great Resignation, and you have helped me reframe it, right, as the Great Awakening in many ways. And it reminds me of what I know about my own heritage, being a Southern Black person. And, you know, I think it was W.B. Du Bois and Black Reconstruction who described, you know, the largest strike in the country happening when 500,000 formerly enslaved Black people simply walked off the plantation, and kind of this individual act of defiance that, you know, ultimately led to a collective movement for abolition and other things. And likewise, we're in a moment now, perhaps at least for our generation, one of the first worker-centered movement moments where so many people have acted with their feet, have left, you know, jobs that don't work for them and pursued jobs and careers that really did, and standards that really did. And even, you know, just like saying, hey, I'm going to work one job instead of three so that I can see my kid's soccer game. And I deserve that. That's something that I should have. And so, you know, it feels like that we're on the precipice of that type of moment. And it really is on us as a movement to translate that into power, to clarify the power that workers already have, but perhaps haven't activated yet in various sectors, and to also translate that into shifts and structural changes that allow us to both imagine and begin to practice the multiracial democracy that our ancestors dreamed about, to perhaps for the first time to build the democracy we're fighting for. And so that feels really really prevalent and prominent in the stories that we learned and that we heard in writing the book. And I'm excited to share that with others.
Absolutely. Well, I'll just close off by saying, Smiley, that I just think you and I have really spent time understanding that we are in a moment of great change. You know, the way our economy functions, to really the fragility of our democracy right now, and the way that work, how people, even the pandemic has really opened up space for people to ask smart, thoughtful questions about work in their lives, right? And what a good job is and what they need. And
that's right.
The point is that much of this change is being shaped by choices that we make as a people, as a nation, as employers, and other stakeholders. But we know that workers can often be left out of that. So we can continue to let others imagine a future that benefits a handful of people, or we can imagine and act on a future that benefits us all for generations to come. And that's really the promise of this book and this moment, that people need to be able to exercise collective power and action to create a future that offers opportunities for the kind of dignity, respect, agency, and, as I said at the top of my comments, joy in their life.
God forbid.
We should close with joy. We want people to experience joy in their lives. So with that, thanks so much for this conversation.